Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. What a joy to be with you on this live stream entitled Why the Metaphysics of Formal Causality is Necessary to Understand Being and Beings. Getting into commentary from my 2019 book, Metaphysics, A Basic Introduction and a Christian Key, as well as my 2017 book, Human and Divine Being, a study on the theological anthropology of Edith Stein, thinking along with Aristotle and Edith Stein about the four different kinds of causes that are involved in every instance of being within the order of creation. Every instance of being. To know a thing is to know its origin, and to know a thing's origin is to know its cause. So Aristotle helps us understand causality in these four terms: material cause, which I've talked about on previous live streams, and we have efficient cause, which I will spell right this time because I always think of effect in relation to cause. So efficient cause, which I've also talked about previously, and I've begun to talk about formal cause, and will continue to do so in this live stream. And then later on, I will move to talk about what Aristotle means by final cause. But thinking especially here about formal cause, what is formal cause in relation to material cause and efficient cause? So I want to start with some commentary again from my 2019 book on metaphysics. We can say that formal cause is the leading cause of all causality because it is the cause that gives form to matter and the cause that gives form to non-objects as well, such as shapes, laws of nature, ideas meaning concepts. As Plato intuited centuries ago, it is the abstract formal idea that stands behind every concrete material being. It is the essential pattern according to which a being becomes and subsists in its distinct individuality. So the whole concept of becoming for philosophy is based on formal causality. And as we've already heard, Edith Stein refers to formal causality as Wonach, according to which a thing is. Wonach in German. So, according to which a thing is. The form according to which a thing is. So the pliability of matter depends on these predetermined forms to which matter adheres in its most microscopic particles and at the most macroscopic level of physical being in the universe. The largest stars, for example, all of the largest galaxies. And so formal causality is what is operating, that according to which something is formed, that is the idea of a thing. The idea, or as Aristotle says, the form or the archetype, the definition of the essence of a being, which must come before its material formation, its material development. There must be these predetermined, we can at least say philosophically abstract forms, but even more specifically, metaphysically, spiritual forms, spiritual objects that we would call an idea, a form, a concept that predates a material instantiation of this particular kind of rock, this particular kind of tree, this particular kind of animal, this particular kind of bacterium, and so on. The forms assign the shape to matter. Matter itself is pure passivity. to the operation of formal causality on it. And philosophy investigates what else we mean by this formal causality. So this we want to do in this live stream. And it may seem like rather dry material. It may not keep our attention very naturally, but I want to say it's absolutely essential for philosophy to think like this, to think in these terms, to think toward the whole. So we think with Plato about formal causality that determines not only that a being is, but what a being is. It determines the existence of a particular being, but also the particular nature of its being. The formal cause is the act related to the potential becoming of a being in its peculiar material instantiation. So again, with formal cause, we're moving more to the metaphysical concept of act. What is acting through an efficient causality on the matter, and the material cause having more to do with the potency of matter to participate in this form or that form. But what causes the protons, the neutrons, the electrons, and at a more macro level, the elements, and at a more macro level, the compounds, the molecules, what causes all of this chemistry of matter to take all of these different shapes and not remain just one kind of thing? It's due not just to the potencies of the matter itself, but to an act, an event, an intentionality in relation to material being that is shaping the matter efficiently, effectively. And it goes back to, it's all anchored in, yes, indeed, the spirituality of formal cause. So the fact that we do geometry is already getting at what we mean by eidos in Greek, morphe in Greek, an eidetic object in relation to a material one, that we deal with actual geometric shapes in the abstract. What mathematics is doing all the time in the abstract is evidence of form in relation to matter. And it's a great paradox that form matters more than matter, we could say in English. So without differentiated forms of matter, no motion or transfer of energy is possible. In a word, no change would be possible without this differentiation of material forms. Diversity of forms is the condition of possibility for the evolution of created being. Yet we ask, why is there a diversity of dynamic forms rather than only one type of inert form? Why is the causal agency for diversification of forms a cause? And why and what is it? I am one of these diverse forms in the universe, and I have the privilege of reflecting on it as a rational agent. I am one of these diverse forms, and I will be the first to say that this causal agency of my being is precisely not me. If I'm honest with myself, with my history, with the development of my being, all these things are happening in such involuntary ways. It doesn't depend on my will, what I am, how I got to be what I am. There's some causality involved that makes me me. And this alterity of the causality of what is a priori in act in relation to the being that I am, but once I was not. And as far as I can tell, with the phenomenon of death, there will be a time when the being that I am will be radically changed. Philosophy is inquiring into all of this before and after, this history of being and its meaning. Second, this causal agency cannot be any one or few of the contingent, mutable, and transient forms at the subatomic, atomic, or molecular levels of physical being. This formal causal agency is not the matter itself. Because again, the matter is not voluntary at all. There's no will. There's no personhood. It's pure material passivity, very transient, ephemeral, evanescent, this matter. These are radically passive particles, fragments of matter, fragments of the whole of this realm of material being, of mass energy, that depend entirely on what else is nearby to cause the change that is inherent to the um, evanescence of their being. Why do distinct forms subsist in time, though, in spite of the very susceptibility, radical passivity of matter? Why do distinct forms subsist, like tree, rock, moon, star, water, elephant, mosquito, earthworm, fern, bird, bacterium, archaea, algae, bryozoan, mushroom, shark, jellyfish, octopus, heron, turtle, human, angel, etc.? If everything is headed toward a disintegrated physical state of thermal equilibrium with a temperature of absolute zero Kelvin, something like 263.15 degrees Celsius, negative 260 some degrees Celsius, negative, absolute zero, complete frozen tundra of matter, where there's virtually no differentiation of material being. There's no circulation of energy, kinetic potential energy. It's a frozen atomic monotony of matter. This is the narrative of natural science, entropy, second law of thermodynamics. This ordered cosmos is proceeding to chaos, to disintegration. Yet why all these diversified forms that hold together in their being in the course of this rapidly fluctuating temporality? Why don't we just get on with it and move to the thermal equilibrium if that is the end? Why do countless forms, especially biological forms, living forms of being, subsist in their being as they are to survive and to thrive for a time as a species, a rather long time? Why do biological beings, especially we human beings, exert tremendous amounts of energy in order to persevere in our stable, substantial, individual, and communal being? Because we would rather be than not be. There we get to the causality again. There's a causality that gives us a script to live, that itself supplies the script for the evolution and development of living organisms. And this script, this blueprint, this architecture of life, of growth, development, this genealogy of being, all this creaturely being is due to formal causality. What we mean by this. Yet what makes me human? Why do I exist as human and not rhinoceros, cheetah, blowfish, seahorse, orangutan, paramecium, oak tree, iron ore, lily, lion, ostrich, eagle, fox, deer, bear, raccoon, mink, mouse, beaver, salamander, snake, toad, frog, lizard, robin, cardinal, chickadee, skunk, lobster, swordfish, cockroach, orb weaver, spider, yeast, babulette, mushroom, moss, virus, amoeba, snow algae, or Senarchaeum symbiosum. I make the point about this diversification of material forms of being. They're not all the same. They're radically different. Yes, there's a symbiosis of life in the biosphere of Earth and all these various ecosystems, but there's such an interdependence, yet diversity of all these different forms of being. And we have to inquire into the cause of this differentiation. What is the being that I am that we call human? Why does my individual being stay intact over the course of time and not disintegrate within a cosmic soup of atomic matter in which there are not individualized biological forms of being, let alone diversified minerals, molecules, and elements? What gives form to matter, distinct individuated forms, from subatomic and elementary particles to planets and stars? What is giving form to matter? The formal causes in relation to the matter that hold matter into these, we at least say, semi-stable forms over the course of time. Species are differentiated one from another due to the distinctive essences peculiar to each. A formal cause determines each individuated species in advance. It's not that hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, over the course of a long period of time, somehow morphed into tiger. What's difficult in our era is to give an apologetic for the self-evident. And perhaps it's just to give an apologetic for rationality itself. Something that should be rather straightforward and obvious to everyone. That there's a very powerful causality that is responsible for this diversification of forms of matter. And it's not just the subatomic particles to which we should give all the credit of what's going on here. So in a culture devoid of divinity, we turn to these apologetics to recuperate even that which holds our own being into existence. And truly, the audacity we have to ask, does God exist? If we even ask the question anymore of the very source of our being. Does the very source of my being exist? Of course it does, otherwise I would not be. The better question is, do I exist? Barely. How do I exist? Why do I exist? And so we're getting into all the various kinds of causality that make this being what it is, that being what it is, make them what they are together in relation to each other, different from each other. And it's a tremendous task, this metaphysics, this cosmology. But we have to dig deep. We have to do it to recuperate the timeless truths about being, including our own. And we're not ashamed of this at all. It's a necessary task. It is intellectual heavy lifting. It is very dry. It's why people aren't lining up at the door of metaphysics saying, let me in, I want to learn more and think more. It's so interesting. The truth about being. So thinking further, that it is a formal cause that determines each individuated species in advance. So matter evolved into tiger, for example, a certain kind of tiger, because that form was there in advance, dictating over the course of time this genealogical development into the perfected form of this kind of being. Otherwise, evolution wouldn't evolve toward this an end. If it's evolving toward an end, it's a predetermined end for the evolution. If there is purpose, the goal is already put there in advance. And this is where we start to mesh into final causality in relation to formal causality in terms of evolution and development of being and organisms. Biological beings evolve and new forms arrive on the scene due to the formal causes that precede the materialization of each individual form. So, in other words, just like there are geometric shapes in relation to matter that adheres to these shapes, and we know this especially through our own fabrication and manufacturing of things, of matter. We create molds. We mold things with our hands, even thinking of something like pottery. That is this primitive form of molding that is so beautiful. And we shape something according to a predetermined form, whether sphere or cylinder, curvature. And so it is with every instance of being, there is a form that goes before it. There is that pattern, that is that according to which the matter adheres as, again, a tiger, a lily, a star. Just like geometry, the same is true for all being, all the different kinds of being that fills the universe, fills the earth. There's a formal causality involved in each one to differentiate one from the other, even to grant existence to these various beings in time. So distinct forms inhere within individual beings because of the formal cause behind each being, at times operating from the inside out, as entelechy, as Aristotle calls it, in biological being, involving, yes, a genetic blueprint, but also a formal immaterial archetype to which even the DNA of the organism is based on this pattern to develop into the full form of the tiger, the porcupine, the bluebird. And at times, this formal causality operating from the outside, as in lithic sedentary beings, different kinds of geological forms, is more an operation from the outside. We don't have an entelechy, a living entelechy, unfolding from the inside out. But what we have is the shaping of the lithic sedentary kinds of being according to external forces that mold it from the outside in. Matter receives form. This is the point, formal causality. Matter receives its respective forms. It clearly does not determine them on its own. That would be like saying potency actualizes itself, which is irrational to say that. There is a prior act that acts on a latent potency to actualize it. There is prior being that acts on a possible being and makes it be, makes it exist. Matter receives form. It does not produce form from its passive, determined, contingent, and mutable status of non-agency. There is no agere in matter. It's completely docile, and we could even say obedient, figuratively, to what is acting on it. And all the more clear when we're talking about volitional action that we experience as human beings. We have volition in relation to our bodies, and this is why we call the soul is the form of the body, because the spiritual volition determines what that body is doing gradually through the maturation of the human being. There is an entelechy that involves so many involuntary processes which also begs the question of the formal causality that is responsible for all the involuntary processes involved in the development of the organism. But then as we grow older, we have this development of our rational capacities, our volitional capacities, and we choose, we decide, we act, we move, we resist. And it's not just atoms doing this. In no way is there a pure determinism, but we have also, within our own experience as persons, we have to go back to a personal formal causality of the personal beings we are. And this is where we get a very much a unity with philosophy and theology, especially in Christian revelation of God as a trinity of persons. The ultimate, absolute, personal, formal causality responsible for our own finite, contingent, barely existing personhood. Mass energy is in itself not self-created, not self-formed, or self-determined because it is not a self per se. So even when we refer to every being as an itself, even in phenomenology, a phenomenon itself, a being itself, there's so many beings we're personifying, giving them the language of self, in Greek autos, in Latin ipse. That's, we can't say this network of mass energy is self-created, self-formed, self-determined, because what we mean by this in terms of physics, there's no self. There's impersonal mass energy. Mass energy is completely impersonal and not free to determine itself as distinctive independent forms that subsist as stable ontological individuals over the course of time. If mass energy is bent on its entropic state of thermal equilibrium, which according to the meta-narrative of natural science, this is where material being is moving, is unbecoming toward a static, uniform, non-differentiated kind of frozen being. If this is the case, why all of the stubborn anomalies of being that resist and rebel against their annihilation and extinction, of beautifully diversified and coexisting being? Why do we ourselves resist death? Why do we not want to get sick, not want to die, not want to have an accident? Why do we resist the disordering and disintegration of our own being? If we follow the meta-narrative of natural science, in fact, if that's one's gospel, then why not expedite the process to thermal equilibrium? Why resist? The resistance itself in our personal rational being attests to more than matter is going on with our being. In fact, we utilize the matter of our bodies for more grand purposes than consumption. And it comes on into view when we have an act of sacrifice, when we have an act of love, when we have an act of self-gift for the other, a love that loves at a cost. We see this is evidence, this is testimony to something more than matter in motion. This paradoxical sacrifice of self for the good of the other, in which the self discovers what it means to be a self. The essence of being precedes and inaugurates its existence. The essence of a being, the essence, the form, precedes and is what inaugurates its finite temporary existence. A formal cause signifies the distinct form or essence that causes an individual actual being to be as it is in this or that form. So we cannot reduce the ontological identity of protons and neutrons and electrons to their elementary parts alone. The subatomic particles, quarks, leptons, gauge bosons, according to the standard model of atomic physics. We cannot reduce the ontological identity of elements to their subatomic parts alone, protons, neutrons, electrons. We cannot reduce the ontological distinctive identity of molecular compounds like water or carbon dioxide or methane to their elemental parts alone, hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, etc. We cannot reduce the ontological, distinctive, stable identity of anatomical and physiological cellular organelles, cells, tissues, and organs to their molecular parts alone, such as water, nucleic acids, proteins, etc. We can't just say because we're detecting what's going on at a micro level that we can reduce the macro to the micro. We cannot reduce the ontological distinctive identities of specific composite forms of being, such as animals, plants, and bacteria, in their unique species configurations, to their anatomical and physiological parts alone, such as hair, teeth, scales, muscle tissue, neurons, etc., their shared derived characteristics, their emergent properties. We can't reduce the uniqueness of a being to its component parts. But there's an integrity of the macro form that is irreducible, and that points us to the formal cause of this being, not just some random conglomeration of subatomic particles. That's a reductionism to the micro, with being dismissive of the macro. And we can go in the other direction too. We can have a reductionism to the macro and a kind of, at the extreme, even in philosophy, a disincarnation of being to idealism, like with Hegel and the sublation of the thesis antithesis in the synthesis, or the assertion and negation to the sublation, the Aufhebung. We don't want to reduce in a Neoplatonic fashion to the one, nor do we want to reduce to the multiplicity of the microscopic and say that's what being really is, just the little bitty particles that are in constant flux. No, as human beings existing at the intersection of large and small, according to this theory of relativity, in our little small corner of the universe, we are the rational agents. We get to explore it all. And big and small is relativized in the 0 point of orientation, that is the personal rational self, the human being. What a privilege it is to be human, to get to think, to get to investigate, to get to ask these questions. And so, as true philosophers, we must resist and renounce every reductionism. And they betray themselves with all of their isms. We must resist and renounce every reductionism in the name of the whole, and especially not let ourselves as human beings, the dignity of our dust, to be reduced to only dust. Our dust is dignified because it's rational, because it's free, because it has the capacity to love and to be loved, because in this planet Earth, we're the only creature able to know and love our Creator, the only creature created for its own sake, the only creature truly created in the image of God. And we do great harm to ourselves to allow God to be eclipsed from our thought process, from our philosophy, to amputate our humanity and say, I'm not going to ascend to theological exploration through the ascent to divine revelation. I'm not going to pray. I'm not going to see this mystical life as a possibility. It's an amputation of our humanity. The ones who refuse to philosophize, refuse to think toward the whole. It's an amputation of the whole. When the humanities go missing from university studies, so does our humanity. This is what's happening today. We cannot reduce the ontological and distinctive identity of specific composite forms of being themselves as parts of a greater whole alone. The greater whole, the whole of which all beings exist as a part, is the totality of created existence in relation to being itself, ipsum esse subsistens. That is God, that is divinity. God, which is, who is the formal causal agency of all that has form, because it has received its form from an eternal actualizing agency that gives form to matter, including that peculiar form shared among biological organisms that we call life. The form of the human body, for example, is the rational, personal, spiritual soul. And if this were not the case, you would not be watching this video. I would not be making it. And you could call me just as well a blue whale, a cactus, or a star and get away with it. We cannot reduce the ontological and distinctive identity of being itself to the sum total of its fluctuating parts, because being itself is not made up of parts, but instead grants all parts a share in its eternal, purely simple, non-composite being, existence itself. So Thomas Aquinas says that the essence of God is existence. We can only say that of God. Because of the clarity of the ontological difference between being itself and beings, between the infinite and the finite, between the eternal and the temporal, we can peel back the onion of being no farther. Being itself cannot be reduced even to itself, because being itself involves no reduction or subtraction, only addition and attraction. Again, from my 2019 book, Metaphysics. And then I just wanted to say a few more things about formal causality, drawing from my 2017 book, Human and Divine Being. So saying some of the same things, but filling it out just a little bit more, and wrapping up this live stream for today. So again, this complex diversification of beings as they appear today cannot be reduced to the yawning span of time, no matter how many billions of years fill our meta-narratives of cosmic evolution. Not that the narratives are inaccurate, but lots of time itself doesn't amount to formal causality. Chronological time itself does not account for formal differentiation and development. If existence change and develop, it is because there is a diverse array of forms to begin with. The variety of forms of being are what change and develop through the many processes of evolutionary metamorphosis. But for something to evolve into something else, the something else has to precede the evolution in terms of form in relation to matter. Edith Stein writes in Finite and Eternal Being, quote, "That which is before and after is grounded in something deeper, which determines the entire process of evolution and leads it toward the end. And this something we have called the essential form, the Wesensform in German. And the essential form of a being is a life that purposively directed power to which the actualized essence owes its existence, if and whenever it corresponds to the predetermined given ends of the development." End quote. And as we shall see eventually, considering final causality, evolution of beings is directed to specific forms of being which are not accidental to formal causality, but determined by it. The form horse, for example, exists today because the historical evolutionary process of the horse's being was aimed at that particular form of being, all the while vis-a-vis other forms of being and environments. If this were not the case, there would be no stable form of horse as such today. In fact, such realities as time itself, life itself, motion itself, evolution itself, and interdependent existence itself beg their own distinct formal causality. Edith Stein writes again in Finite and Eternal Being, quotes, nothing temporal, that is, nothing whose being is becoming and passing away from moment to moment, can exist without a supra-temporal ground. Profoundly put, what she says there. Nothing that is existing in time can exist, can become, and pass away from moment to moment, this in between, the no longer and the not yet, without a supratemporal ground of being, holding it in being, holding the precariousness and ephemerality of time itself in being. Nothing temporal can exist without a timeless formal structure, a Gestalt in German, which regulates the particular course of the temporal sequence of events, das Geschehen, and is thereby actualized in time. So all that exists, including the totality of existence and beings that exist, owes its reason for being to formal causality proceeding from pure actuality, that is to say, God. Stein writes again in Finite and Eternal Being, all these exemplary forms we're talking about, this formal causes, have their being, according to the Augustinian interpretation of Plato's doctrine of ideas, which St. Thomas follows here, in the divine mind, we can say. Where do the forms come from? The divine mind, who assigns them, who ordains them, who creates them. God alone creates form. Even as human beings can't do it. Even Immanuel Kant points this out, that what we're working with in imagination is a synthesis of previous experiences, of previous forms. Even if we synthesize a new, what we might think is a new form or a chimera or something, it involves already actualized forms. And what's actualizing all these forms? There is a source, there is a ground, there is a primary causality in relation to this diversification and plurality of finite forms. And this we say in, even in philosophy, we can think of the mind of God in this sense. Um, the creative source of formal origin, the only truly original source of being. And if we think that we're making contact with this metaphysical first principle of pure act, of absolute being, of first cause, as source of everything else that is not the cause of itself, is clearly not the cause of itself because it changes. There's nothing of matter that doesn't change. And if it changes, it's changed by something else. Matter as potency depends entirely on actuality, actualizing it into being and forming it into a this or a that. And the formal causal agency in relation to all of this material being that is purely susceptible to the forms in which it participates is the divine mind. So this is very rich. And the payoff is it's a recuperation of theology, of divinity, to take it seriously, to let it be for us once again the queen of all sciences, the apex of human thought, where reason itself, in a very humble and most rational gesture, yields to divine revelation, to teach it what it cannot learn on its own. The whole process of teaching and learning, of pedagogy, depends on the humility of the understudy. I have much to learn, as well as the humility of the teacher, of the professor. But for St. Augustine, there's only one true teacher, Christ, the inner teacher of every person. And every faithful professor, authentic teacher, testifies to that one, Christ, the inner teacher, who guides us as a shining light to these harbors of truth. So, distinct from these ideas, these forms, distinct from them are those created forms which have their being in things. And these created forms, distinct from the forms in the mind of God, as material beings are distinct from geometric shapes, analogously. And these created forms must be evidently understood as the actualized natures in things, the metaphysical natures in things, what makes a thing what it is, what makes it different from other kinds of being in the universe. The being they receive is the actual being which they have in things. So Edith Stein, finite and eternal being. Yet there are many forms we encounter that do not change over the course of time, and these are the forms that ground universal rationality and objective truth. They are subject neither to revision nor to manipulation. They bear an eternal givenness insofar as they do not adapt to changing circumstances and are immutable. What fields of study deal exclusively with such immutable kinds of forms on the finite side of reality? Mathematics, geometry, and music. And music. To fill out the ancient quadrivium, in addition to these three fields, was the field of astronomy and the apparent order and timelessness of the celestial bodies for the ancient thinkers. In any case, such fields expose the purity of form in relation to their material instantiations within the material physical universe. In fact, we speak of order because of such orderful forms: numbers, shapes, formulas, octaves, ratios, laws, theorems, axioms, postulates. This is the stuff of self-evidence and the very landscape of logic. In ancient Greece, there was a sign above Plato's academy that read, "Let no man ignorant of geometry enter." Geometry, from the Greek words ge, which means land and earth, and metrikos, metric or measure, is devoted to studying the inherent order and formal causality of the cosmos through attention to shape, vectors, angles, congruity, and the laws of shape. Geometry deals with the given architecture of the universe, and without the formal causality of this given architecture, we in turn would not be able to design or create anything. We would not have our architecture. But is not our architecture filled with these geometric forms that precede our blueprints? So, even at 25 years of age, Edith Stein writes to her good friend Roman Ingarden, quote, "I busy myself these days with physics and mathematics in the interest of the philosophy of nature," end quote. To understand the nature of beings, it is necessary to devote careful study to the formal causality of beings, including mathematics and the intrinsic laws of the physical order. And Edith Stein was acutely aware of the way in which formal causality underpinned the peculiar individual and relational characteristics of being. So we're going to stop there for this live stream, but thank you for joining me and thinking along with me on these, rather difficult things to think about. It always stretches the mind every time, trying to think in all these various facets of causality in a very polyhedral way, a many-faced way, because there are so many causes contributing to actual existence that we explore, that we examine, first of all, in the material order of being. But what we're moving to is the recognition of the spiritual order of being once again in relation to matter. So to understand something like our own human nature, composed at once of the unity of body and soul, matter and spirit, and that the soul in relation to the body is the form of the body. To understand our own nature, we need this quadratic causality of Aristotle. We need its corroboration through Thomas Aquinas and Edith Stein and John Paul II and all of these incredibly helpful, enlightening thinkers, and then through the 20th century, and now pushing ourselves. We're in the 21st century. Thank you for joining me. May we all continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you in the next one.